We are continuing our walk through a collection of Jesus' most famous teachings called the Sermon on the Mount. And why are we taking several months to walk through this? Well, call me crazy, but if we're going to follow Jesus, it's probably important that we know what he actually taught and what his expectations of his followers are. And so we're spending time looking at these teachings. Now, today in particular, we're going to look at a passage that has been taught and sometimes mistaught. It's been used and sometimes even abused. I think there's been some good teaching, some bad teaching. And so my goal today is hopefully just to bring some clarity. Jesus is going to be talking about today lust and adultery. So it's a good time. You know, if you're a guest, you're like, I picked the worst week to show up at church. But a couple of caveats right here at the beginning. The first thing is this message is going to be PG-13. So if you've got young kids, you feel like maybe they're not ready for it, I would highly encourage you, take them to our Bridge Kids area. See, for us, Bridge Kids is not like childcare during the service. It's actually ministry. We're teaching them scripture memorization. In fact, we have a 4-year scope and sequence that if they're a part of our kids ministry for 4 years, they're going to get a heavy dose of Jesus, but they're actually going to make their way through the whole story of the Bible as well. So I could talk a lot about that, but don't have time for that today. But feel free to check that out. Second, I know that there's different categories of people here this morning. Maybe one category is people who you grew up in the church, you followed Jesus, like you've been very faithful and consistent, and you're here because you want to learn how you can better follow Jesus, and that's awesome. And I would just challenge the people in that group that we wouldn't become so accustomed to the teachings of Jesus that we just kind of say, yeah, I've heard this before, and dismiss it and move on. Now, there's another group of people that maybe you had been in church for a while and stopped for whatever reason. Maybe there was some kind of hurt or wound from a church, or maybe you had some doubts, some questions. You felt like you couldn't bring those to the church, and you're just back and you're ready to start from scratch and build your faith from the ground up. Or maybe you never went to church, but you're trying to figure out, how do I build my life on Jesus? And if that's you, what a great series to be a part of. Like, what better way to build your faith than just let's look at what Jesus taught and go from there. But there is a third group. Maybe you're here today and you didn't want to be here. Maybe somebody forced you to be here. It was a parent, a spouse, maybe a friend made you show up, and you don't really want to follow Jesus. You have no intention of following Jesus. And if that's you, number one, I'm glad you're here, and you can go back to playing Angry Birds or Candy Crush or whatever outdated phone game reference I can think of in just a minute. But what I would say for you is sometimes Christians, we put the cart before the horse. We get things backwards. And sometimes the way that we present the message of Jesus is we take this issue of sexuality and we put it first before everything else. So if you're here and you're not sure about the whole Jesus thing, my goal is not to convince you to adopt a Christian sexual ethic. In fact, I don't think the goal of the church is to make the world more like Jesus. It's to make Christians more like Jesus. And so if you're figuring it out, here's what I want you to do. I want you to spend more time focusing on Jesus, who he claimed to be his ministry. But for the rest of us who are here and we've made that decision to follow him, even though this may be an uncomfortable topic, I think it's one that's very important. Because what we're going to see, we're in the middle of a section of teaching where Jesus is hitting on all the major things, right? Like we talked about anger last week, talking about lust and adultery this week, talking about divorce next week. We're going to look at things like retribution and retaliation, the words that we say to other people and about other people. Jesus is hitting on these big, heavy topics because when we follow Jesus, there is no area of life that's off limits to him. In fact, I know sometimes in my life I've been guilty of saying, I want to follow Jesus, but I don't want him to tell me what to do with my money. Or I want to follow Jesus, but I don't want him to tell me what to do with my calendar. I want to follow Jesus in all the areas except this one. But the reality is, if you're only following Jesus 50%, you're not following Jesus. If you're only following Jesus 90%, you're not following Jesus. If we're going to follow him, it's a commitment to go 100%. And so here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to read the passages that we're going to focus on this morning. Then we're going to kind of step back, get some context for what Jesus is saying. And then I've got some practical implications for his teaching. And then, of course, we'll have our Q&A time at the end like we do every week. Sound good? All right. Are you with me? All right, okay, let's jump in. Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. Jesus said this, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. So, Jesus starts off his teaching by saying, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery. Now, to give you some context for what's going on in the culture at Jesus' time is they had a very specific definition of adultery. So number one, adultery only happened when body parts came into contact with one another. So like emotional affairs, that was not considered any kind of adultery or infidelity. That's number one. Number two, it was only adultery if you had sex with a married woman. So there's 4 categories, we could say, in the general population. You have single men, married men, single women, and married women. And you can have sex with any group as long as it's not married women, and you would not be committing adultery. So a married man could have sex with a single woman. They would not consider that adultery. Now, why is this important? See, what Jesus, I think, is going to do is kind of challenge the excuses that we tend to make around the issue of lust and adultery. It's easy to see then that there was a heavy emphasis in that culture on not the men, but the women and their responsibility not to lead men into temptation, something of course, in our culture would be completely foreign to us, right? We never do things like that. In fact, in Jesus' day, we have the religious leaders or the Pharisees, but there was a group of them called the bleeding Pharisees because they so did not want to be tempted by women that whenever women were around, they would cover their eyes and they kept bumping into things, so they called them the bleeding Pharisees. There was one rabbi around the time of Jesus who shared a story that one day there was a young boy who had carved a hole in a fence and was looking through that hole to try to glimpse the rabbi's daughter. So the rabbi goes out to confront him and he says, "What are you doing?" Now listen, imagine this confrontation our day and age. We live in Georgia. I'm sure there might be some firearms involved in some kind of confrontation, this peeping Tom. And he goes out "What are you doing?" And the young man said, "Well, if I'm not worthy to marry your daughter, could I at least be worthy enough to catch a glimpse?" And you know what his response was? He went back to his daughter and he says, "You're cursed. I wish you would return to the dust because of the way that you tempt men." So heavy emphasis on women being the guardians of sexual purity in that culture. Now, when Jesus says, "You have heard it said, do not commit adultery," I remember he's a first century Jewish rabbi teaching first century Jewish people. Where would they have heard this before? 10 Commandments. All right, this is the audience participation portion. I think we can do better than that. You're going to have some more opportunities in a little bit. They would have heard this in the 10 Commandments. Now, the 10 Commandments, I think, sometimes get a bad rap because if we just read, do not do this, do not do that, and God just doesn't want anybody to have any fun, and he's so restrictive and repressive. But I think that completely misses the point of the 10 Commandments. Let's remember, they were given by God through Moses to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai. All right, so here's pop quiz time. Before the Jewish people were at Sinai, where were they? Egypt. Much better. All right. When they were in Egypt, what were they? Slaves. Great job, guys. I love the energy this morning. So these are people who've been enslaved for over 400 years. So the only life they've ever known is the life of a slave. The only life their parents have ever known was the life of a slave. The only life their grandparents, their great-grandparents had ever known was the life of a slave. And when you are enslaved, the message you are bombarded with day in and day out is that you are somehow subhuman. You are a piece of property that belongs to somebody else. You don't have any rights or privileges. You are less than human. I mean, think about from their perspective what a normal day would be. You'd wake up in the morning in a nation where they're worshiping all of these other gods. And sure, your family has told you stories about your God who promised that your people would be great and they would be blessed and they would bless the world. But it's really hard to feel blessed when you're enslaved. And it's real easy to look out and say, those other gods, they seem to be winning over my God. And then you actually go out to the brickyard and you have a quota that you have to meet. And so you have slave masters who are there. And if you don't hit your quota, they're going to beat you. They're going to berate you. They can even kill you because you're just a piece of property. You don't matter. In fact, if you have something they want, they'll just take it. That there will be verbal abuse and physical abuse, even sexual abuse. You have families that are ripped apart because you are not human. You're a piece of property. And for 400 years, that's what the Jewish people were told. So when they are set free from slavery, okay, they've been delivered out of Egypt, but now God wants to bring the Egypt out of the people. See, he actually has to teach them, here's what it looks like to be fully human. Here's what it looks like to be free. Because slavery can teach you a lot of things, but it does not teach you how to be free. The same could be said of our American prison system, right? Like the prison system doesn't teach you how to be free. It teaches you how to be a prisoner. So when people are released from prison, there's a high rate within the first 3 to 5 years that they're back in prison. In the same way, slavery didn't teach them how to be free. So that's what God is doing through the 10 Commandments and the rest of them. And so we actually have the 10 Commandments we're going to go ahead and throw up here on the screen. So look at what God's doing. Saying, don't have other gods before me, right? Don't worship the gods of Egypt. Worship me. Don't have idols. Like worship me. In fact, you can go through here and see he's just going through and teaching them, this is how you lived before, this is how you live now. For example, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, right? Do you get nights and weekends off when you're a slave? Do you get an extra day off for St. Patrick's Day? No, they didn't have St. Patrick's Day. Boom. But also, no, you don't get any time off. So God says, here's part of being free. Take one day every week, rest, and worship me. He's going through, that's all he's doing. And there's a number of ways that you can look and divide up and group the 10 Commandments. Just for the sake of our conversation, we've kind of split them into the first half and the second half. The first half primarily relate to people's relationship with God and their family. The second half is people's primary relationship with others. So then you see on the second column there, you say, don't murder. Because guess what? Everybody, including your enemy, including the person you hate, is made in the image of God. They are not less than human, so you don't get to take their life. You know, we don't commit adultery because guess what? That covenant that couple is in, like we honor that because they are people made in the image of God, so we will not commit adultery. You know, somebody's been blessed with something you want. We don't get to take from them because God has blessed them with it, and we will wait for God to bless us. We're not going to steal. We're not going to lie and ruin other people's reputation because they are made in the image of God. All he's doing is teaching them how to be free. And this is important because if you remember from a couple weeks ago, what is Jesus doing in these passages? If you remember, we talked about in Jesus' culture, they had taken the 613 commands in the Old Testament, and the rabbis had developed a system where they would categorize some as light and some as heavy, or some as the least commandments and some as the greatest commandments. And you were supposed to follow the greatest commandments, and you would follow the least as long as they didn't come into conflict with the greatest commandments. And so what Jesus is doing is he'll take the greatest commandment and say, listen, don't just follow that, follow the least commandment too. Because I don't know about you, I have a tendency to be like, well, I'll follow God in the things that are easy, but I don't necessarily want to follow him in the things that are hard. And so Jesus says, hey, the great command, like don't commit murder, like we understand that, but I'm telling you, don't even harbor anger in your heart towards somebody else. He's saying, don't just follow the greatest command, follow the least command as well. And so Jesus pulls out another one of these great commands. He says, you've heard it said, do not murder. And then he extends it to a least command as well. So Jesus says, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I'm telling you, anyone who looks lustfully at a woman has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So let's break this down. Jesus says, anyone who looks, what does it mean to look? Because in the English language, to look could be a glance, you know, you're admiring something. It could also mean a stare, like something that's longer. What is Jesus talking about? Well, the New Testament was primarily written in Greek, and the Greek word here for look is like an intent stare, like almost leering at somebody else. And for the men in the room, if you're not sure what this is like, ask the women in your life. I'm pretty sure at some point they've been subjected to this kind of stare. It's like a stare with intent to do something. And he says, anyone who has this kind of stare, who's looking at a woman, and our translation says lustfully. which honestly is a horrible English translation from the Greek. The Greek word here is epithumeo. And lustfully, if you remember your parts of speech, that is an adverb, right? It's modifying the look. So if you look lustfully, but epithumeo's a verb. So if you look with the intent to do something, well, what are we doing? What does epithumeo mean? It is a strong desire or passion. And by the way, it is neither a positive or a negative term. It's just a passionate longing for something. In fact, Jesus uses this word when he talks to his disciples and says, I long to share this meal with you again. Right? Like he uses this word to say, this is this strong passion and desire that I have. But the other place we will constantly see this Greek word show up is in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Old Testament was written in Hebrew. They translated it into Greek. It's called the Septuagint for you Bible nerds out there. It's constantly the word used to translate the Hebrew word for covet. In fact, we don't just find this in the Septuagint. Paul himself uses epithumeo to translate covet in Romans 7, verse 7. What should we say then? Is the law sin? Absolutely not. But I would not have known sin if it were not for the law. For example, I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, do not covet. So every time the word covet appears, it's the word epithumeo. Now again, this is a neutral term. It is neither good nor bad, but there is a connotation where it can be good, and there's a certain context where it can be bad. So if Jesus says, hey, I passionately desire to be with you, that's a good use. What is the bad use of coveting? Well, let's look back to the actual text of the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. It says, do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Do not have this desire for your neighbor's house, your neighbor's spouse, your neighbor's servants, your neighbor's stuff. In other words, the prohibition on coveting doesn't mean you can't desire things. It means you cannot desire other people's specific things. So you're allowed to desire things. Like, that is not bad. You can desire to go on vacation. You can desire to own a house. I desire to have a good pair of sandals, right? Like, this is my everyday attire. Now, where I would cross the line is if I look at you and say, ooh, I like those sandals. I want those specific sandals. Not to say I want some like that, but I want your specific sandals. And if you can actually go back up and throw the Ten Commandments back up there, Jewish rabbis and commentators noted that of all the Ten Commandments, they are all external behaviors except for the prohibition on coveting. That's the only one that starts in the heart. Because can you tell if somebody murdered somebody else? Probably. Can you tell if somebody's lying? Probably. Can you tell if somebody's committed adultery? Yeah, these are all outward actions. But can you look at somebody and tell if they are coveting? No. And what the rabbis and commentators have said is that the reason coveting is included in the Ten Commandments is that becomes the source of breaking all the other covenants. So if you are committing adultery, why is it? It's because you are longing for something that does not belong to you. Why would you steal from other people? It's because you have this passionate longing for something that doesn't belong to you. Why would you murder somebody? It's for whatever reason you're passionately wanting to take their life, so a right that you do not have the right to. So they would say that coveting is from the source of all that. So because of that, you can see the first 9 would be considered greater or heavy commands, because you can tell those from the outside. And sometimes coveting could be considered a lesser command. So what is Jesus doing? He's taking a heavy command and he's extending it to the light command. He's saying, you have heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I'm telling you that anyone who looks longingly, with intent, desiring to take something that does not belong to them, has already committed adultery in his heart. Now, I want to be very clear. Jesus is not saying that lust and adultery are the same. And I say that because, believe it or not, there are people who will say, well, I've already lusted in my heart. I might as well go ahead and have the sex that comes with it. Okay, so that is not what he's saying. What is the point that Jesus is making? If you are looking longingly at someone else to take something that does not belong to you, in your heart you've already turned and committed yourself to this pathway of adultery. You've already turned your heart in the direction of committing adultery. What Jesus is saying is, where is your heart pointed? Like, guard your heart. He says this is so serious. Like, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. If your right hand is leading you down this direction, cut it off. Now, I think Jesus is using hyperbole here because he's making a comment about the heart, right? And about our desires. But how many of you know, like, you can lose a body part and still desire something, number one. And number two, if you could lose a body part and it would change desire, he left off a pretty important one that would probably solve the problem. So I don't think he's saying cut off body parts. I think he's saying take this serious. Do whatever you can to guard the direction of your heart. Now, to me, this is so helpful because we're going to talk a lot about sex in our time together. Like it or not, this is like when dad sits you down, you got to have the talk. Nobody likes it, but we got to do it, okay? Jesus is talking about it, we got to talk about it. But when Jesus talks about lust, it is about so much more than sexual thoughts and fantasies about people, though that's included. Because when Jesus talks about lust or coveting, it's also, oh man, I really wish he was my husband. Look at the way he treats his wife. Look at the kind of dad he is. Oh man, I really wish she was my wife. Do you see how she takes care of him? You see all the stuff she does around the house? See, it might manifest itself in sexual fantasies, or it might just manifest itself in a longing to have somebody else be your spouse. I think a lot of times we want to limit it as much as we can, and I think what Jesus is constantly doing is expanding. It's about your heart. What is the direction of your heart? Now, we've kind of gone through the text now. We've looked at all the words, all the context. What are some practical implications? I was talking to our broadcast crew before this service, and they said the next slide you're about to see, he said he'd been running slides for a long time. He's never seen a slide like this in church before, so buckle up. You ready? Practical implication number one, sexual desire is good. All right, let me repeat that to make you completely uncomfortable. Sexual desire is good. Like, this is God's idea. I think sometimes we're told like, oh, we need to avoid sex. And no, sex was God's design. In fact, the first command in Scripture to Adam and Eve was to be fruitful and... Now, God could have had us be fruitful and multiply a number of different ways. He could just have like babies like bud off of our shoulders and fall to the ground. He could have had the storks bring the babies. But instead, God's design was that two people would become one. There would be this commingling of souls where they are fully known and accepted, and they fully know somebody else and accept them. It is this beautiful, wonderful picture. And gosh darn it, it's fun, right? Like this is God's design. In fact, I love the way one person put it. They said, we were sexual long before we were sinful. See, sex was there before sin entered the picture. Now, does sin distort good desires? Absolutely. But sexual desire from the beginning is God's plan. I mean, even in the biology of what happens when people are having sex together. Like, your body is flooded with different hormones. One of those is oxytocin, which is sometimes called the bonding hormone. In fact, another time that this hormone is present is when a pregnant woman gives birth, and all of a sudden her body and the baby's body are flooded with oxytocin. And the first time a mother holds their child, they are chemically bonded together. So like, there is truth to the saying that there is no connection like the one a mother has with her children. And in the same way, when two people become one, when they have sex together, they are actually bonding together. Like, this is hardwired in our DNA. And the reason that I'm like making this point like probably more than I need to is because I think that there's been a lot of bad teaching on sex and sexual desire in the church. And I think that we've gotten a lot better about it in this generation, but maybe some of you grew up and in church you were kind of taught like a Mean Girls view of sex. So you remember that scene? They're like, if you have sex, you will get gonorrhea and you will die. If you have sex, you'll get chlamydia and you will die. If you have sex, you will get pregnant and then you will die, right? Like, we're just told constantly, sex is bad, sex is bad, sex is bad. And then all of a sudden you get married and they're like, all right, it's good now, go ahead, have fun. And I cannot tell you the countless number of couples that I have counseled who have such hang-ups around sex and sexual desire because they were constantly told sex is bad, and then you're just supposed to flip a switch and all of a sudden I don't have any issues with it whatsoever. In fact, there's been so much damaging teaching around this. And if you want a resource that really walks through this, it's a book called The Great Sex Rescue by Sheila Gregoire. She did like the biggest survey that's ever been done of Christian women and what they were taught about sex, their attitudes now. It's a great book for men to read, is how we can actually like help with good sexual desire and not perpetrate the bad teachings on sexual desire. But we have to understand that there's been some bad teaching, but that sexual desire is good. And by the way, when Jesus says anyone who looks at a woman to desire to take something that doesn't belong to them, he's not saying you can't look at someone and appreciate that they are attractive. He's not saying you can't look at somebody and say that is an attractive person, a beautiful person. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking a long, intentful stare with the idea to take something mentally or otherwise that does not belong to you. So sexual desire is good. And we have bodily reactions when we are attracted or we find other people attractive. And so again, we kind of teach people sometimes like these natural bodily reactions are sinful. We made this point last week. You cannot always control when you get angry, but you can control what you do with that emotion. You cannot always control when sexual desire or arousal comes up, but you can control what you do with it. Which leads me to the second implication, is that sexual desire has a context. Okay, so sexual desire is good, but the context is always in Scripture in a loving covenant relationship. In fact, I don't want to spoil too much of what we're going to talk about next week, but people come and ask Jesus a question about marriage and divorce. And what does Jesus do? He does what we do every week. He goes back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, right? He always goes back to what was God's design. He talks about a husband and a wife uniting together. Like, this is a beautiful context of sexual desire. And there's this really cheesy illustration, but I'm going to use it anyway because it's so good and I couldn't think of anything better. But I have a fireplace in my living room. And this morning it was a little cold, so I get up and I'm getting ready for the day. I just turn on the fireplace. I'm ready to go, and I'm looking at it, and the fire is beautiful, and there's warmth, and it's great. It like adds to the room. But if I took that fire and moved it 2 feet forward, am I going to think that it's beautiful and isn't it like, look at all the warmth? No, because it's burning my house down. The same thing in the right context that's beautiful and beneficial and good, in the wrong context can cause a lot of destruction. And we take this sexual desire and we point it towards anything outside of our marriage relationship, it causes destruction. Some of us in this room know exactly what that looks and feels like to suffer the destruction of misplaced and mishandled sexual desire. Again, when we have sex, that oxytocin, it bonds us. And what studies have shown is every time you have a different sexual partner, the first bond gets broken, a new one is formed, but it weakens a little bit. And the more partners we have, the less chemically bonded we are to that new partner. So I don't know if you've ever been around a toddler with Velcro shoes, but you know what this is like. Because when you first get the Velcro shoes and you put them on, it holds tight. But after about 3 months, those straps are just flopping in the wind. It's the same thing with that connection. At the beginning, it's strong, but the more partners we have, the weaker it gets. I want to be careful, because we talk about this, it's really easy to feel like this is a message of shame and condemnation, and that's not at all what I'm talking about. I actually think Jesus is the great physician. He's the healer. And even if you've had multiple partners, I think that he can bring healing in this part of life. But I also know that I think God is a healer, but I'm not going to go play in traffic to find out if he can heal me. I want to make sure I set up safeguards on the front end and know that even when I make mistakes, God's grace is enough on the back end. Does that make sense? See, even misplaced desire, we have to have the porn conversation as well. Porn is so prevalent in our culture. In fact, so prevalent that there are increasing rates of teenagers experiencing ED because that bond has been broken and remade over and over and over again. Some of the latest studies I've seen show that people's first exposure to pornography these days is 10 years old. Right, like I gave a PG-13 warning. Like they probably have already seen stuff or know stuff. And it's heartbreaking because when you engage in porn, you're making connections with these images. Not only that, but we can talk about the fact that what are we doing? We're dehumanizing somebody else. We're putting them back in slavery and saying the only thing you're good for is my sexual gratification. And we can get into all sorts of conversation about how it forms the way we see other people, forms the way we see ourselves, how it contributes to human trafficking. But even in the use of things like porn, like that, sexual desire is good. When we exercise it in the wrong way, it brings damage and destruction. And so we have to make sure that we're practicing it in a marriage context. This is, by the way, why I think that Paul talks about having a healthy sex life is important for marriages, right? It's going to bond people together. So be careful what we're doing with those desires. Now, third point I want to make real quick, and then we'll throw it open for Q&A if anybody's brave enough to ask a question today. The last kind of implication here is we are responsible for the direction of our desires. So when Jesus is giving this teaching, he says, and everyone who looks at a woman with this desire to take something that does not belong to them, that he's already committed adultery in his heart. Who is he speaking to, men or women? That was an easy one, right? He's speaking to the men. Now, is Jesus saying, well, women don't struggle with this? No, Jesus isn't stupid, all right? But to go back to the beginning, in their culture, the onus for protecting sexual purity was always put on the women. And so men would just say, this is just the way men are. This is just how I am. This is who God designed me to be. And God says, no, you take responsibility. See, Jesus doesn't ever go to women and say, you need to cover up. He says, men, you can gouge out your eyes. The responsibility is put on us for the direction of the desires of our heart. We have this conversation in our house all the time. I talk with my boys about BCD, blame, complain, defend. Whenever things happen, at least my tendency is to blame other people or to complain about my circumstance or situation, to defend my actions. But when you BCD, all you're doing is you're making excuses. That's all you're doing. And you can either make excuses or you can make progress, but you cannot make both. And some of us will just list excuse after excuse and justify why this way of life and the way we look and treat other people is okay. The reality is we have to take responsibility for the direction of our desires, and we should take that seriously. Now, what practically does that look like? Listen, we all have smartphones in this room, probably. And at the touch of a button, you can look at anything, you can talk to anyone, you can do a lot of different things. And maybe for some of us, what it looks like to guard the direction of our heart seriously is you need to switch from a smartphone to a dumb phone. Now, here's another caveat I want to give, because I know there's a lot of people and you use the purity software and everything. Those are great tools. But here's the dark side of that. I've also seen people who for years will leave these guardrails in place because there's not actually been a change of heart. Listen, you can put up guardrails, but if you have to use a dumb phone for the next 30 years, I guess that's better than lusting. But at a certain point, you have to ask yourself, am I positioning myself for Jesus to change my heart in this? Is Jesus going to change my heart enough where I can be around people of the opposite sex without objectifying them? Has he changed my heart enough that I can actually send an email from my computer without being tempted to open up a tab in a secret browser? He has to be changing our heart. But there is a time where we need to put up some guardrails, because it is better for that to happen than for us to suffer in the fires of hell. So we need to do that. The other warning I want to give is that because of the robustness of Jesus' teaching here, that's not just limiting to sexual fantasies, for some of us in this room, it means deleting social media, not because you're tempted to look at sexually explicit images, but because you're looking at the life other people are living and you're coveting it. You see the vacations they go on, you see the lifestyle they live, and all you're doing is you're either denigrating them, putting them down. You're saying, well, I'm so spiritual and this is what, maybe you need to delete all that because you're coveting somebody else's way of life. See, it goes far beyond just what we do with our bodies. Jesus says it happens to be the direction of our heart that he is most concerned with. All right, we've said a lot. I have 20 seconds left. So does anybody have a question? You want to raise your hand? I want to start with that. Anybody have a question? All right. Why do I say the heart and not the mind? So I try to use the language that Jesus would have used. He talks about the heart a lot. Guard your heart. In Jesus' culture and context, much the way we think of the mind, they would think of the heart. The heart is the seat of the emotions and the will and what you would use to make decisions. So they didn't think of the mind the same way that we do. But that's a great question. Anybody else? Okay, yeah, go right ahead. Yeah, you gave me 20 seconds to answer that one. All right, okay. How would God treat the transgender community? I think everywhere we see Jesus, we see the people that were pushed to the margins of society. So I think if Jesus were here today, I think he would be hanging out with a lot of the people that typically religious people would have pushed out to the margins. I think he would have loved them. I think he would have encouraged his disciples to love people without the expectation of changing them. I also think Jesus has a high view of sexuality and marriage. We're actually going to talk more about this next week when we talk about marriage and divorce. So we will hit on this issue in a little bit more detail when I have more time next week. But what I would challenge all of us in this room, because I'm going to assume, and maybe this is wrong of me, that most of us are trying to follow Jesus. A lot of us have probably been trying to do this for some length of time. And a lot of us probably grew up with fairly conservative background, and you're kind of taught, listen, you need to get your life together to come to Jesus. And I think we need to remember people need to come to Jesus, and then he will take care of any issues that they have going on. Our responsibility is to love and to trust Jesus and the Holy Spirit to bring about any change they see fit. So, great question. All right, so I'm going to ask a question now. As we head into a time of communion, we do this every week because listen, all of it, and I'm going to, listen, we've been talking about sex and now I got to pivot. What are we going to talk about in our time with Jesus, right? So here we go. We'll have our communion stations up. We have our prayer stations up front. You know, for some of you, maybe this is an issue that you've really battled and struggled with, whether it's in the area of pornography, whether you feel shame or guilt over previous relationships, whether you just know in your heart you have longed to have a spouse that's different than your spouse. And maybe today the response just starts with coming to Jesus in prayer and surrendering that. Listen, I hope you don't feel a message of guilt and shame today. What I think Jesus is trying to do is remind us that we are constantly to come back to this question: where is my heart pointed in the wrong direction? And as you take communion, this is the question I want you to ask Jesus. Jesus, where is my heart pointed in the wrong direction? Now, some of you are, I know we have people who are in the process or do already have their pilot's license, so I could totally butcher this. But this is my understanding of how autopilot on an airplane works. The way it was explained to me is that you can set coordinates from point A to point B, and then if the plane drifts off course, autopilot just bumps it back onto course. And whether or not that's true, I want to use it for my illustration today. Because I actually think that's exactly what our relationship with Jesus should be. I don't know about you, my heart is constantly being pulled in this direction or that direction. And by asking Jesus, where's my heart pointed in the wrong direction, it gives him an opportunity to put me back on the right path. And maybe it is in this area of coveting or lusting, but whatever that looks like, I think there's areas that we can be off. The most dangerous place we can be off is just to be off 1 degree, because for a long time we'll look like we're on the right path, but you wake up one day years down the road and wonder, how did I get here? And all it would take is 1 degree of him bumping us back on track. So let's ask him that question today. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we're thankful that you call us in every area of our life to surrender to you, because I know if it's left up to me, my life will be in pieces. So I pray right now, any areas in my life where my heart is off course, where it's pointed in the wrong direction, would you bring me back? Any area I've been trying to hang on to, I surrender that to you today. And I pray for each and every person in this room. I pray against any kind of shame or condemnation. I pray right now that your spirit would move and breathe fresh life and freedom. For people who are struggling with an addiction to pornography, that you would break those chains. I pray for people who've been dissatisfied in their marriage and are looking to other places, that today would be a moment you just bring them back. In whatever areas of our life we've been tempted to covet and to turn from you, we just repent of that today. Because Jesus, we just want to be more like you. It's in your name I pray. Amen.